we're just going to get started. So we have whoa, is this loud? No, that's great. Okay, testing. We're just going to kind of get started a little bit early to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end and everything. I just want to thank you all for making it up here, enjoying the panel again. It's been a year or two since we had this panel, and history seems more important than ever, given everything that's happening in the world right now. So I wanted to thank you all for making it out here and supporting my comic and coming by to see me. And we're going to do a quick introduction of the crew that we have up here on the panel. We are going to talk a little bit about some questions and stories that we have amongst ourselves for a little bit. Then we'll make sure we open up near the end for any questions that you may have or any elaborations or things like that. But again, thank you so much for being here. All right, we'll start off to my left.
Hi everybody, my name's Eric. I'm one of the co-curators here at the Northwest Nikkei Museum. We're located on the edge of the International District here. And when I first met Tony, he came to our museum about 2 years ago. And I believe he was still doing Comic-Con, so he was in a rush, very disheveled. But, but he asked about the 442nd. And we just so happened to have like a Foot Locker who belonged to one of the veterans. And I think we spent about 2 hours in the back room just digging through old stuff for Tony to look at. And that's how our relationship started.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that day. I was quite disheveled. My name is Tony Moy. I am a comic artist, watercolorist, and recently, I can slowly start to add the title writer to my titles. In the past year or so, since we had this panel, I've started working with Marvel Snap. For those of you who have played the game, done some stuff for some tabletop fantasy publishers. So I have a bunch of art like that coming out, and also doing covers for comics. I recently did a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Naruto crossover cover, which was a lot of fun. And just a whole bunch of ninjas on that cover. So I'm really excited for some other covers to be coming out later this year as well, which I can't say. But this story that I am so lucky to have stumbled upon has truly given me so many amazing experiences and allowed me to meet so many people that have, made me see the world in a different light that, wasn't quite prepared to when I first started this journey a little over 2 years ago. So I'm excited to share a few bits of my stories with you guys. My table here is at I-2 in Artist Alley. So after this, if you want to come by and check me out, check out some of the original art, as well as some of my other stuff, please do come around, and we'll talk more.
Hi everyone, my name is Maddy, and I work as a co-curator alongside Eric at the Northwest Nikkei Museum. A bit more background about the work we do. We mainly focus on Japanese American history in Seattle, but have kind of broadly in the recent past started expanding that to the general Pacific Northwest. So although when Tony first came and kind of asked for a bit of expertise or just any sort of insight into this history he was researching, we did our best, like Eric mentioned, but we usually defer any sort of military history, since that's not our specific focus at the museum or area of expertise, to Mike. So thanks so much for being here.
Mike Yaguchi, past commander of the Nisei Veterans Committee. I met cleaned up Tony, by the way. Otherwise, I wouldn't have answered that darn door. So glad that Eric and Maddy brought Tony. And the other day, Tony's dad, who's right there by the mic. And wave your hand there, Dad. Hey, there you go. We were able to show Tony and Tony's dad the Nisei Veterans Committee Memorial Hall. It was founded by returning World War II Nisei soldiers, primarily because many of the posts, some of the major VSOs, voted not to accept them for membership. And that was unfortunate. but you make something out of something bad, and they founded this thing called NVC, Nisei Veterans Committee. So we are a war veterans organization, although we recently received our change to our IRS status to be a 501c3 instead of a C19. So we're very happy about that. Thanks to Tony for getting this story to an even larger audience and to a younger audience. I'm the token old guy up here, right? So for all of you to at this level of participation, I just want to thank you. Tell the story to your colleagues and friends, your circle of influence, because it's a great American story.
It is.
It really is, and Tony will expand more on that. So thank you.
Yeah. One of the things, real quick, I've been going to conventions and telling this story for a couple of years, and so I've started to see repeat people come back and they remember me, and we talk more about the research and everything else. But the most inspiring feedback that I get is when I get kids. I've gotten a few kids over the past year. They saw me 2 years ago and they came back and saw me last year, and they're telling me how they did their school report. They're 10, 12 years old doing their school report or history fair or something like that about the 442nd and about the soldiers and everything else. And they're like, "Oh yeah, I listed you as a source." I was like, "I'm in bibliography. It's great." So yeah, that part is like, talk about making sure the stories continue. That one report talks to 20, 30 other students, and they talk to their parents hopefully, and you never know how the word of mouth goes. It's important, these stories. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I have a couple questions, probably just to get the discussion rolling a little bit. I think first of all, probably go to you, Tony. Can you speak a little bit about how you came across the history of the 442nd and how you kind of started this entire journey when it came to the comic and the history?
Sure. We were coming out of COVID, right? Sort of the last year, I think it was it 21, coming 22 or something right around there. And there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiments, we'll just say, happening in the news. And as an Asian, that kind of stirred some fires within me. And my response as an artist is, even though I do like a lot of comics and anime and cool images and pictures, is that I make sure to give myself leeway to express myself if I have something to say as an artist. And so I did a series of Asian American portraits, just kind of saying like, a lot of sentiments that you would, closed-minded sentiments where, go back to where you're from, go back to China and stuff like that, right? And so kind of just reiterating the fact that we've been here. We're a part of the fabric, from I.M. Pei, who is a Chinese American who designed the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What's more American than rock and roll, right? Bruce Lee, and there are some common ones. And in that research of searching for other Asian Americans who have influenced the fabric of America, I stumbled upon a documentary. Documentary went through Asian American history from a gold rush to the railroads, and they got to World War II. I'm like, okay, they're going to talk about the internment camps. And for the last sentence in that chapter about World War II, they kind of mentioned, and some of the Japanese Americans fought in the 442nd and became the most decorated unit in U.S. history. Fade to black. Move to the next chapter of history. And I was very incredulous because I was like, what? The most decorated soldiers are Asian? Well, what is that? And I immediately went online and immediately went to search for it, and my jaw immediately fell to the ground. And I was like, wait, this is real. I thought there was like, if you look at it in this certain way and this certain light and in these certain statistics, then maybe. And I was like, oh. And as we're coming out of the pandemic, luckily we weren't traveling a lot yet and everything else, so I was kind of stuck at home just burying my nose in as much as I could find about these men. And eventually I found myself, after months and months of kind of scraping the information as I could, is getting angry. Why isn't this out there? Why don't my friends know about this? Why didn't I know about this? Why isn't it a movie? Why isn't it a Band of Brothers show or something like that? Because the history and stories are there. And when I get angry at myself, I was like, okay, well, you gotta either stop getting angry or do something about it. And as I looked in the mirror, I was like, well, technically you can do something about this if you want to. And slowly that's where it started formulating in my head that maybe I can. It was going to be a daunting journey. I had no idea where it would lead me. I'm not a historian. I'm not an expert researcher. Spent a lot of time on the internet, to which, if I hadn't come in contact with Michael over here, he corrected a lot of the myth that's on the internet. And he was like, I can tell you exactly where you got that from and what site you got those numbers from and why you're wrong. And I'm like, oh, please tell me. I know nothing. I'm not a historian. I'm not a World War II buff. And so that kind of got me realizing how much I really didn't know once I got into it, right? One of the first steps when you ever try to learn something new, whether it's a skill or anything else, at some point you realize, oh, I now know what I don't know, right? Which is a very important thing. And that I realized I had to spend a lot more time doing some research and stuff like that. So that's how I stumbled upon their story and began a crazy journey. So, remember our first conversations?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so let me just add something really quick to kind of put it in context. You know, he had some of the panels in his watercolors, which are fantastic, by the way. If you haven't seen his website or actually looked at some of his artwork, please go down to his booth and take a look at it. And one of the, what do you call that, call-out button? The balloon?
Yeah. The word balloons. And
this soldier's talking to another soldier, and he says, aye, aye, sir. Now look, only Navy people talk like that. I work for a Navy admiral. I'm a retired Air Force. I work for a Navy admiral. He didn't even make me say that. You know? So, it was small things like that, but it added to the story actually, and this history of him being more specific, more attuned to things like that, I think is a testament to how devoted he is not only to history but to his craft, right? Because he's got a worldwide audience, and he's being really responsible to us as Americans, to the legacy of the 442 soldiers, but to his audience. So kudos to you for, not having that kind of pride of authorship, which we have seen in other areas before, so.
Thank you very much. That means a lot that you're saying that in front of everybody.
I want my $5 commission, by the way.
Lunch is on me.
Okay.
At McDonald's.
Yeah, I think in addition to what Mike was saying about the authenticity of Tony's comic, the reason Tony was in our museum for so long and at the NVC as well is he takes the time to really look at the small details to translate back into his art. He was very interested in how the World War II, belt buckles and straps on a backpack. So everything so from the facts that he places in his comic to the little details in his art, everything is very well researched and authentic, which I really appreciate.
If you're going to do a history story, I want to try to immerse the people into the art, into the story, and my biggest fear was having people come up to me at really how it starts. Why it's doing that? Because when I go to shows like this, my real big fear is to have someone who's an expert and they come up to me and is like, the bullets that go into the M1 don't really line up that way or whatever else, and get a lecture at my table. And so it's really out of fear, and fear of embarrassment that I spend so much time to make sure everything's right.
I wanted to jump in really quickly. Mike, if you would be willing to maybe provide just a bit of background information about the 442 for people who may not be familiar or people who may know generally just the history but not any of the specifics.
Yeah, so let's take a poll. How many people are familiar with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team? Oh, good number. And some familiar with segregated units during World War II, you know? Okay, Tuskegee Airmen, Navajo Code Talkers,
Yeah.
right? Puerto Rican, okay, Filipino Scouts. Okay, good. That's good to see. So the Nisei soldier came about mainly because the war was going badly. I mean, Hitler had a head start in 36, right? The Blitz and all that and everything. And then by the time the U.S. got into a two-front war, right, which was both Europe and the Pacific, on the heels of Pearl Harbor, you know, they wanted to volunteer for a variety of reasons. But the three key words that you usually see in websites is fear, racial prejudice, and the absence of political leadership who could have put a squash to this, which if you think about 9/11, think what you want about George Bush, but we'll have a story about that later. And so they weren't allowed to volunteer. The Army and the draft board classified them as 4C, enemy alien, unfit for military duty. And because the war was going so badly, you know, a little bit later next year, the Army merged two infantry regiments from Hawaii to form the 100th Infantry Battalion separate, and sent them over to McCoy and to Shelby to train up. And because of their training and how well they were performing as soldiers, you know, very smart men, most, if not all, had a high school education, many had college. The Army realized that they had kind of a hidden gold mine in terms of resources. And so that gave rise to the president authorizing the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which started their training after the 100th was formed up and trained up. So it was really out of necessity, but they weren't allowed to. And then a year after they had started to form up, in February of 43, Maddy brought this up to my attention, their draft status changed. You know, so over at the Nisei Veterans Committee Memorial Hall, when we take people through our military museum, we focus a good chunk of that time on those who volunteer. Because if you get drafted, right, you have to go. Or if you say no, then you find other kind of service or you go to jail. All right. So these small numbers who volunteered from inside of these camps and a large chunk from Hawaii really deserve our attention. You know, that sliver of the greatest generation who volunteered from inside of these incarceration centers, really, I think we owe an awful lot to.
Yeah, that writing, painting, and drawing and illustrating some of these scenes that I've only researched about, you kind of immediately put yourself in those positions, right, from a creative standpoint. And there are definitely times when I get to those pivotal, like, what would I do, and like, how did this person feel, you know, from the no-no boys, the people who actually did dissent, to the ones that actually did volunteer from inside the camps. There are definitely moments where I have to step away from that creative process and just like reset, you know, because it does get heavy for this, and you know, in the solitude of me and my art table, you know, there are definitely choked up moments even for me.
I think I might go back to Tony and ask you a question. When you go through, well, this is a two-part question. When you go through the process of planning the webtoon, whether that is through storyboarding and also researching the history, and like you mentioned earlier, the specific kind of buckle that certain soldiers use, or there's certain type of bullet that goes into a certain gun, what kind of processes, both, I guess, following this meeting with Mike and learning more about this history, do you go through for your comic to ensure not just historical accuracy, but also a sort of flow within your own story and within the larger grand story of the 442 comic that you're creating?
Yeah. There's two goals that I sort of have when I kind of get any piece of story that relates to them. Every medal has a story, right? There's a description of what that soldier did to earn that medal, and it's usually about a paragraph long. And some of them are just crazy, right? You're like, oh, they earned this because they single-handedly captured 13 German soldiers, and a few other words, and you're like, but how? How? And march them back across from no man's land, through no man's land, and then march them back across it to be interrogated and everything else. And I'm just like, ugh. And either I spend a lot of time trying to figure out like what those details were, or some of it I just kind of have to, make my best guess and find the stories and the thread that makes the best sense to make sure that it doesn't feel like just a bullet point of facts, right? Because we don't just share we don't share encyclopedia articles, right? We share stories, right? Whether verbal, whether we link to something or whatever else. So that's the goal that I'm trying to find first and foremost, is to what is the story that I can create. And I can tell you the facts of the rescue of the 442nd within a few minutes, right? 5 minutes. But to make it a full story with a beginning, middle, end, the challenges and everything else, to make you feel that, is a lot more of a lot more trial and error, a lot more testing things out. Like, does it make sense to me? And run some ideas by a few of my compatriots who are in the industry to see, how that works. So that's one, and the other is, like I said, in this journey, I've met a lot of people that know a lot more than I do, and I defer a lot to that. A curator at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, when she found out why I was there, and after talking to her a little bit, there for the visual research as much as the actual historical research. And, she said, oh, if you ever need anything, just email me. And if we don't have it out on display, I can go back into our vaults and take some photos for you, or whatever it is that you really need to see, whether it's epaulets on the shoulders, or with the soles of the soldiers' boots and what they look like, or shoelaces, or something like that, right? Just to have an idea. And maybe it shows up for a split second, and maybe it doesn't. But in my head, also, some of that information gives me confidence to create some of these scenes as well. So there are just a variety of people that have been so helpful, that are part of this journey.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing, Tony. I guess I could ask one question to Mike. I know I want to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. We usually have a lot of people who would like to know more, but do you have any particular story, Mike, regarding the 442 or any of the related battalions that you find to be either the most impactful or historically relevant that you would like to share with the audience?
Well, I think the story about the incarceration, which isn't the most integral part about the 442 soldier, but I think Dan Inoue, when he talked about he and his fellow Hawaiians went to a camp and discovered, because at the time, the Hawaiian guys and the mainland guys, they're kind of butting heads. You speak like the plantation owners English, and we don't talk pidgin, and we're always butting heads. And he said when they came back from that dance at the camp, it was pretty quiet. And usually, guys are pretty rowdy. They talk about the gals that they met, stuff like that.
I think it was Jerome,
Arkansas. And that really helped unity, if you will. But if you fast forward, what does that have to do with today? I'm trying to remember what I was talking about. Remember, senior guy, okay? If you fast forward to today, where this story, which should resonate with folks, might not, and having guys like Tony talk about it in this kind of art form, relates back to what Dan Inoue and what the Hawaii boys were trying to get their heads wrapped around. Mm-hmm. And the question for today is, what would you do in a scenario like that, where your constitutional rights have been violated, but yet you swear as an American soldier to fight and defend that? Is it a document of convenience? Or is it a document that we should hold closer to our hearts during times of stress, during times of uncertainty? And for me, hearing and having talked to Dan Inoue about, things like that, for me today, the lessons learned that if you look a little deep into his art form, his comic, I think helps carry a conversation in a lighter way that maybe our colleagues, our friends, grandkids, I don't have grandkids, but grandkids, young cousins, it provides a way to explain some of the lessons of yesterday and the context back then to today.
Yeah, there's so much of that revolves around gaining perspective, right? The important part about the Hawaiian Japanese going to Poston or going to Jerome, mm-hmm. and seeing what the mainland Japanese Americans had to go through was them learning perspective, right? Like, oh, that's why this is so important for you. That's why, because the ones from Hawaii didn't really have a internment camps that was so delayed that it was, and so minor in Hawaii that it didn't really have a major effect on those who volunteered as Hawaiian Japanese. And so gaining that perspective, you can literally see that moment in all the research that I've done, from Daniel Inoue's kind of discussion of that to some of the other soldiers that have talked about it, to letters that are written during that time that I've been able to read, that just heading up to a camp, seeing that barbed wire, seeing the guard towers, and then realizing the guard towers the guns aren't pointed out. They're pointed in. Was such a big change of perspective, I think, for a lot of these soldiers. And that's one of the reasons why they fought so well. They were a unit in every sense of the word. So, thank you. What time is it right now? Anyway,
It was 11:38.
38. Okay, let's open it up to some questions if anyone has it. There's a microphone up here.
Yeah, what changes did you make from things that were contemporary 1940s, that language or attitudes that didn't fit your story and also maybe would have been off-putting to a modern audience?
Some of the things that have been challenging for me on a very simple level, and mostly because I don't have the experience, is the pidgin language, right, from the Hawaiians. That was because I don't speak it, and it's also an evolving language, right? So the slang today for pidgin is very different than the slang from the 40s. Other things that are I'm heading into very difficult territory is that my story is also wants to pay attention to both sides of the trenches, right? Warfare is horrible no matter what time era, but when you're talking about the Germans back then and Nazis and things like that, and you're trying to, we're all human on some basic level, right? And so I don't want to have just stormtroopers on the other side, because around the time of the Rescue of the Lost Battalion, which is the main focus of my story, the Volkssturm, which is the young boys and old men that were sent to the fronts for Germany was also started to happening, right? Because they're running out of able-bodied men, and they're sending these 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old boys to the front. And those are topical too. So kind of get to a point where, you know, I don't want to fully empathize with everything on the other side per se, but I do want to humanize it to a certain extent, and that's a tough line to make sure is sort of not crossed as well. One of the things personally as I get into some of those scenes is that I want to make sure that the symbol of Nazism isn't fully always visible in my artwork. You'll see it a little bit, you see a partial, you see it turn and everything, but the last thing I want is my artwork to be usurped because I used a symbol that I don't agree with. So that is something that I'm getting into in some of the artwork that I haven't published yet.
Here's something that you might want to think about. Some of the old World War II, some of the old Nisei who are captured on video, and they talk about that time, you'll hear them refer to mainstream society as American. And here I am, I've been very purposeful saying I'm an American of Japanese ancestry, putting that word American so that when everyone here thinks that I'm actually part of that picture in your mind. But the Nisei, my mom included, when she says American, what she really means is Caucasian. So when you look at some of these old historical, footage from that era, or you listen to some of these second-generation Americans of Japanese ancestry talking about that period, and they say Americans, just kind of tuck in your mind, which would be hard for you to capture in your comic.
Yeah.
But this is where. And I'm not a sociologist, historian, or any of that kind of stuff, but we noticed in so many of the videos, and I turned to my dad and I said, I noticed you saying that a lot, and you'd hit me upside the head and say, next topic, but just kind of keep that in mind, right? When you look at some of those old footage,
it's very interesting.
That greatest generation.
Any other questions?
Yeah, first, just thank you so much for being here. I teach US history. This is class on Monday.
You're welcome.
I'm fascinated by what you were saying about this regiment, the 100th that was formed. So I'm wondering if you could explain more how the experience of those in Hawaii was different than on the mainland, and then how those two groups came into contact with each other.
Yeah, that's a great question. The Hawaii boys in the population, they weren't placed by large numbers into War Relocation Authority camps or into Department of Justice camps. There were two different types of camps, if you will. Incarceration centers, I think is the term of art today. So the Hawaii boys, if you will, were already were part of two infantry regiments, and they were pretty segregated, if you will, just by the population. And so when they formed up and were shipped off, the mainland folks were all in camps. So the difference is just by that. The vast majority were not locked up versus the camps. And then the second thing is they went first, because they weren't locked up. Even though their draft status was 4C, many of them were put back into these two infantry regiments, and it formed up consolidated to form up the 100th, and so they kind of went first. I've seen some literature that says they were a test bed to see if they were loyal, would they actually take their training seriously, which, by the way, you got to give the Army some credit, because nobody's a soldier overnight. You got to learn how to do all the things, to do that soldier thing, but then you've got to be kind of smart about being a soldier, right? You just don't stick to what you were taught. You have to fit, your training with the battle picture, in front of you. So you got to give the Army some credit. If you're going to be credited with being the most decorated unit of its length of service, it was only 18 months of combat. World War II lasted a long time. 7 months of combat for the 100th, 11 months of combat for the 442. You know, it's 18 months, 21 medals of honor.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an incredible, and only 3 infantry battalions. It's a small unit, so to have those kinds of accolades, and to have, was it 8 different presidential unit citations? It's like a Medal of Honor for a unit, if you will. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. But you got to give the Army credit for training them well.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I'm also going to be focusing on, is getting into the training camp, and a lot of them gaining that perspective, gaining some of that training, and reflecting that on the battlefield from what I can deem from research and things like that. So that training camp and the things they learned there was very important, because from the internment camps, the Hawaiians had some experience within the framework of the Army and military. Those coming from the internment camps, many of them did not, right? They through straight perseverance and strength of spirit that they kind of made it through. So, anything else?
Could you summarize?
Oh, let's get the guy who stood up by the microphone.
Do you
Yeah, next.
have any comment on the narrative in Daniel James Brown book, Facing the Mountain?
What was the question?
Do we have any comments about Facing the Mountain, the book? I will defer to you.
I'm on the back cover. Very early, a colleague at the University of Washington, well, let me answer your question directly. It's a fantastic book, and a little self-promoting. A Medal of Honor recipient, James Okubo, who was a medic, on page 282 of the hard copy, through the eyes of Fred Shiosaki, K Company, saw James Okubo through this horrific firefight get up to check on my uncle, John Matsudaira, he's listed in the page. We always knew that we thought James had pulled him off the line. But to see it in print from an eyewitness was pretty cool.
Wow.
Daniel James Brown was put in contact with me when I was stationed on the East Coast to help him connect with many of the Nisei soldiers on the East Coast because of my affiliation with some Japanese American organizations there. So, being part of that at the very beginning stages was pretty cool. He's very thorough. Tom Ikeda out of Densho was very instrumental in that as well. But just getting questions and being a part of connecting him with some really fantastic soldiers from that era was pretty cool. Plus, I got to make it on the back cover. So.
Yeah,
I'd rather be a footnote, though.
that was one of the first books that I stumbled across. There are not too many about them, but they're there.
They're making it into a movie, by the way.
Oh.
Yeah, that's been going on for about a year now, I think. And
Oh, nice.
yeah.
You had a question before?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you could summarize Daniel Noy's story a little bit, because I know it's pretty amazing.
Daniel Inouye was Senator Daniel Inouye is how I kind of knew him. I knew him very tangentially as an Asian American senator, and until I started this project and journey, all I knew was that he was missing his arm from some war. I don't know which one, right? I'm not a war person, but he was definitely one of the first figures that I ended up doing research on and most accessible in terms of his story, because there's actually lots of video of him talking about it. And how he lost his arm, right? His right arm is just, if I were to write a Hollywood script about that story, and tell you like, oh, I made this up, you would be like, hey, that's a little bit far-fetched, right? Basically, him and his unit were tasked to take out 3 machine gun installments on a hill. A lot of them get hurt and killed before they even get to the first one. And kind of to hear him talk about it, there's some YouTube videos, you should try to search him up and hear him talk about it, but he's like, you do a lot of stupid things in war, and I don't really quite fully remember, but they tell me I did this. And he charges up to the first one because I'm sure they don't expect a single lone soldier to be charging a machine gun installation, and throws a couple grenades and takes out the first one. And before the second, and by the time he gets to the second one, they exchange a couple bullets, and he throws some grenades, and he takes out the second one. By this time, the third one up that hill spots him, and they lower an RPG, and right as he's about to throw a grenade, right, the RPG explodes right near him and misses him, luckily. And as his ears are ringing, as his vision is kind of coming back, he realized he had pulled the pin of that grenade, and he has to like search for this pin. He's like, oh, where is it? And he sees the grenade still being held in a hand connected to an arm that's not fully connected to him anymore. He pries the grenade out with his left hand, right? He's right-handed, obviously, about to throw it. He pries that grenade out with his left hand. And the way he also describes it is just like the luckiest throw ever. You know? And he tosses it, and it lands perfectly within that machine gun installment and takes them out. Rolls over and takes a break. After that, it took him, I think by his account, his men, the remaining men finally catch up to him and kind of take care of him. And I think after that, it took him about like 16 hours before he got medical attention. Right? So he's just a tourniquet or whatever else. And he remembers being laid out on a cot in a medical tent or something, and the doctors would go by and look at each trauma and like, okay, looks like we can save him, and they kind of come to him and then they move on. And the next person comes is the pastor, last rites. And he kind of grabs the pastor a little bit with his left hand, or he let him know, it's like, hey, I'm not ready to go yet. And the pastor kind of looks at him, calls the doctors back, and the doctors just, okay. And they take him into surgery, and supposedly something like 16 units of blood, or some crazy amount of blood to keep him alive and keep him going through surgery. And he talks about how a lot of the blood that is probably coursing through his vein was donated by the 96, which is the all-black battalion. So
That's why he considers himself half African American. That's a quote.
yeah.
Danny Inouye, in a nutshell, you can say draft status 4C, fast forward to Senate Pro Tem.
Fourth in line.
Third in line. Presidential succession. If there's a story that tells you how great this country could be and was, and that's it to me. From 4C,
Yeah.
unfit for military duty,
Enemy alien.
to Senate Pro Tem.
Third in line.
In my mom's lifetime, huge.
So listening to the panel, it occurred to me I don't know much about the history of segregation within the Army following World War II. Really, the only thing that comes to mind is Little Rock when I think of that, despite the fact that segregated units played a large part in both World War I and World War II. So I was wondering if the panel had anything you could say about the legacy that the 442nd, maybe some of the other segregated units left behind or contributed to desegregation within the armed services following World War II.
Well, I think it kind of sums up a comment a congressman gave, I think, to your system. By the way, this gentleman here in the camera is the current commander of the Nisei Veterans Committee. It's a shameless plug. Mr. Deo Watanabe. His sister Mari Watanabe, who's an Oregon legislator now, by the way.
First Japanese American.
Great.
We were stomping the halls of Congress to get the men of the Nisei soldier of World War II from the 100th, the 442, and the Military Intelligence Service, the Congressional Gold Medal. One of the comments that the congressman said was, you know, we wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for the valor of the 100th of the 442. Not that the achievements of the MIS was not known to him. It's just something about a battle record. And so you've heard Tony talk about the most distinguished unit, length of service, and size. That had, you know, kind of a ripple effect, because that awarding of the Congressional Gold Medal, if you pay attention to who else Congress has awarded that medal to, you will see a lot of what was then segregated units, recipients of. Was it 6888, right? It's a great movie, by the way. 6888, the Code Talkers, the Filipino Scouts, which, by the way, they did the legislation.
Yeah.
They did the verbiage in the legislation really well. If you were assigned to that unit, to that effort, you were an authorized recipient of the Congressional Gold Medal. We didn't quite get that right with the 442 100th MIS one. It was only for the Nisei soldier, you know. In contrast to the stamp, right? The Go for Broke stamp, which recognizes the 33,000 Nisei soldiers or airmen of World War II. That's all inclusive, so.
Yeah.
I was curious about what the motivations were for particularly the Japanese soldiers that had been interred in camps to actually volunteer to fight for the United States. And you touched upon it a little bit at the beginning, but I'd love to know why they said they did it.
Yeah, so I have 5 uncles that served in the 442 or in the MIS from my family. And I remember my Uncle Frank, who received the Silver Star, his comment to me was, "Beats here." Honest to God, that's the quote. Beats here, meaning inside of Minidoka in Idaho. The other two, I never posed that question to them, nor did I receive any feedback. But others, well, except my Uncle Kenji, he said that, you know, you're an American. It wasn't, the war wasn't going right. You know, they needed men to fight. Yeah. And you know, I'm gonna go fight for my country. Yeah. Even though he was in Minidoka. Yeah. So, but there were others who chose not to. There were others from my community who harassed those who volunteered. That's another side of the story that we should talk about, right? It wasn't everybody, oh, apple pie, come on, let's go do this. Yeah. There were those who harassed families of those who volunteered. And we should talk about that, because, look, you can't go around beating people up because you disagree with them. Yeah. I mean, think about that for today, right? I got some folks who have different views of some things, but you know, we talk about it. You know, we don't go out in the backyard and settle things that way, you know, but that happened back then. Yeah. So, you know.
Some of the zeitgeist immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when that happened and got in the news, everyone wanted revenge or wanted to fight for America or wanted to do something. So much so that for a short period of time, the US military thought about allowing women to join the armed forces, right? Because everyone felt hurt by Pearl Harbor. So there is just that sentiment. If you considered yourself American on any level, there was a lot of that, like, you've attacked us, we're gonna come back. On some of the more altruistic sentiments of people who have decided to volunteer and fight, that I've read in letters and research, was that they knew that they didn't know when the war would end, but they knew that if the Japanese Americans' only contribution to the war was to be behind barbed wire, regardless of how wrong it was, that Americans, to your point, you know, Caucasians, would just simply say that they didn't fight for this country. And so to quell some of that future sentiment that would potentially come back to them, they were like, I'm gonna fight so that they can't say that we did nothing, right? But there's a whole wide range from beats here to some of the most altruistic and idealistic men that you'll ever know.
I think it's important to say a few comments about how the experience and the stories from the 442nd influenced the decision-making by our government after 9/11.
This is your story here.
Okay, well,
Okay.
on the heels of 9/11, well, just before 9/11, President George Bush had dinner with every single one of his cabinet members, and one of the ones was Norm Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation. And I got this from Norm. So he says, hey, talk to me about this camp thing. That was the best George Bush impression I could do. And so Norm Mineta began to describe, what the incarceration was, who did it involve, why was it done, gave him the conclusions from the Commission on the Wartime Relocation of Civilians. And 9/11 happens. George Bush convenes his now wartime cabinet. And believe it or not, I was stationed in Japan, and I was tasked to get the Treasury Secretary back, and there were no freaking planes, so I had to go steal one with the air attaché to get him back stateside. And wow, yeah, that was something. But when his task to the cabinet was, look, we need to come up with some new security protocols, but don't bring back to me anything that singles in, our Arab American friends that has anything to look like what we did to Norm's family. And he was talking about Norm Mineta. So remember I said earlier, we talked about why did this incarceration happen? Fear, racial prejudice, and the absence of political leadership. If it wasn't for Norm Mineta's conversation with President Bush, I'm sort of inclined, if you're from that era, I was overseas, I could only see things, right, on the TV and emails from my family, that we might have had a repeat.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
Right? Might have had a repeat.
I had a conversation with a coworker, and I said, you know what they're going to do? They're going to start rounding up people who look like from the Middle East.
Yeah.
I said, oh, no, that'll never happen again.
Yeah.
Sure enough, like 2 weeks later.
All right?
There were conversations in the public.
A very conservative justice from the Supreme Court was talking to, I think, a law class in Hawaii, and he said, don't think that America is so smart that we won't repeat.
Yeah.
Lessons we should have learned about the incarceration, the absence of due process, don't think we're so smart that won't happen again. He warned the law students about that. I mean, there's a quote on one of the buildings in DC that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And that's not just the military folks about vigilance.
There was the presidential order that allowed the internment camps to occur, Executive Order 9066. That wasn't repealed.
The 9066 authorized the War Department to create military exclusion zones, right? And then other things happened from the Western Defense Command to do the...
Yeah. But 9066 was a starter. It was a starter for all that. And that wasn't repealed until...
Gerald Ford.
Yeah, until 1978. That law was, that rule, I guess, not law, rule was in place potentially to be used for everything that happened from World War II to 1978. So, getting a little notification, maybe one quick question, or we're gonna wrap this up.
When are you gonna finish the comic book?
Yeah. I'll let you know.
So keep buying.
Yeah. Yeah. When I first started the project, I thought I can get it done in just a couple of issues. I was like, oh, this is a cool story. I'm going to be able to wrap it up and tell it in a little bit. And then I meet this guy, and he tells me all the stuff I don't know. And I meet other people, and they start telling me how important, I start learning how important the story is to, the entire community. And I realize how much I have to fully research and go off. I'm lucky because I've been able to stand in the foxholes that the 442nd dug. I walked in the same hills that they fired bullets in. And so in fully rounding up as much research as I could possibly kind of do, I learned that there's a lot more to tell and how to restrict it and playing around with that. So what started as 5 or 6 issues of comic that I can probably finish is now probably about 5 times that of script that I'm slowly starting to piece through. So it'll be a while. I appreciate everyone's patience before that. Thank you. And if you want to support, please just on a very simple level, just like and follow me online and YouTube and Instagram. I do have a Patreon if you want to be more direct with all that. And just come by the table and we can chat some more. I do have a couple comics and an art book that I'll give away in a moment. Yes?
Could we tell us again where to find you downstairs?
I am at table I2 of Artist Alley. Just if you walk in, I'm on kind of the left side of the block of all the artists down there. And so please come by the table and let me know that you're here. Anyone have a birthday this weekend? We have yours is Tuesday. Anyone have a birthday today? Yesterday? Tomorrow? Tomorrow come up. And Sunday? All right, you have one person Saturday. And someone is Tuesday? Okay, so those are the nearest birthdays. So you two kind of come up. And then I have an art book for story takes place at the end of October. Whose birthday is on Halloween? All right, there. Come up and get an art book.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.